Ethan had always dreamed of making history. As a young diplomat, the opportunity to represent humanity on an intergalactic scale was something he had worked his whole life for. It wasn't every day that the human race was invited to join the peace talks between planets. Today was supposed to be the day he made a name for himself. The day had arrived. He was standing in the grand hall of an alien council chamber, surrounded by representatives from multiple alien species, including the towering and intimidating Rylora, a fierce warrior princess from the planet Xarzul. Her people were known for their strength, pride, and ancient traditions, all of which made her both respected and feared. Ethan felt the weight of the moment. This meeting was going to decide whether humans would be considered equals in the intergalactic community. He stood tall, trying to keep his nerves in check as the council session began. The room was filled with alien beings, each more exotic than the next. Some had long, glowing tendrils, others had scales that shimmered in the light, and there were even a few with multiple eyes. But among them all, Rylora stood out. She was tall, towering over most of the other aliens, and wore a crown-like helmet that glowed with an otherworldly energy. Her eyes were sharp, calculating, and unflinching. Ethan couldn't help but feel a chill whenever they met his gaze. The negotiations were difficult. Every word spoken had deep meaning, as the various species argued over trade agreements, land rights, and diplomatic relations. Ethan had been trained for moments like this, but nothing could have prepared him for the sudden shift that was about to take place. It happened so fast. One of the other alien representatives had made an offensive comment towards Rylora's people, something about their outdated customs. She stood up in fury, her voice rising in anger, and she began to walk towards the individual who had insulted her. Ethan, sitting near the front, saw the tension in the room escalate. He could sense that a fight was about to break out. The last thing the peace talks needed was violence. Without thinking, Ethan stood up and moved toward Rylora. His hand reached out instinctively to grab her arm, intending to stop her before the situation turned worse. But as soon as his fingers brushed her skin, the room went silent. Rylora froze. She didn't look at Ethan immediately, but the entire room seemed to hold its breath. The council members exchanged worried glances. For a moment, it felt like time had stopped. Then, with a sharp turn of her head, Rylora's eyes met Ethan's. There was no anger in her expression, but there was something cold, something calculating. Ethan immediately realized the gravity of what had just happened. In Rylora's culture, physical touch was not taken lightly, especially between strangers. She was a high-ranking warrior princess, and touching her without permission was considered not just disrespectful, it was a violation of their sacred laws. Her voice cut through the silence. "You laid hands on me, human," she said, her words icy and filled with authority. "You have broken the law." Ethan's heart sank. He could feel his palms growing sweaty as every eye in the room turned toward him. What had started as a simple gesture of trying to avoid a fight had now become a political nightmare. He opened his mouth to apologize, but the words felt stuck. He hadn't meant to offend her. He hadn't meant to break any law. He just didn't want the peace talks to fail. Rylora didn't wait for him to speak. She turned to the council, her voice booming across the room. "According to our laws, touching one of high rank without permission is a grave offense, and this human has committed that offense against me." The room buzzed with whispers. Some of the other alien representatives seemed uncomfortable, but no one spoke out. They all knew the consequences of violating such a law. Ethan looked around, his mind racing. Was this how it was going to end? Was he going to be thrown out of the peace talks because of a simple mistake? Worse yet, was this going to lead to war? Rylora raised her hand, silencing the room. "The punishment for this is clear," she said, her voice strong. "According to our ancient law, the human who has violated my personal space must now become my mate. It is the only way to restore balance and honor." The words hit Ethan like a physical blow. Mate. His mind struggled to process the situation. He looked at Rylora, her expression unreadable. Was she serious? Could she really mean that he, a human, would be bound to her in such a way? Ethan opened his mouth to protest, to argue that he hadn't meant any harm, but no words came. The law was clear in Rylora's eyes. There was no room for negotiation. He had touched her. He had violated a law of her people. And now, according to their customs, the punishment was a forced bond. The silence in the room was thick. The council members exchanged looks, but none dared to speak against Rylora. As the minutes passed, the reality of what was happening set in for Ethan. There was no way out. He had broken an ancient law, and now he had no choice but to face the consequences. He wasn't sure what to do next, but one thing was clear. The life he had known was about to change forever. Ethan walked quietly behind Rylora as she led him through the halls of her magnificent palace. The walls were covered in shimmering stone that reflected the soft glow of overhead lights. The air smelled of exotic flowers and incense, but none of it could calm the storm swirling in Ethan's mind. He was still trying to process everything that had happened, how he'd gone from being a diplomat for peace to now being forced into a bond with an alien warrior princess. Rylora's strides were long and confident, her presence commanding the space around her. Ethan couldn't help but feel small in comparison. She was everything he had imagined in terms of power and beauty. Tall, imposing, and filled with an energy that demanded attention. She wasn't just a princess. She was a leader, and she carried herself with the grace of someone who had always been in control. As they walked, the silence between them was thick. Ethan wanted to speak, to say something, but every time he opened his mouth, the words seemed to disappear. What was there to say? What could he possibly say to her? He had broken the law of her people, and now he had to pay the price. They arrived at a large, grand door at the end of the hall. Rylora paused before it, turning to face Ethan. Her eyes held no emotion, but there was a certain calmness to her expression, almost as if this situation was something she had accepted long ago. "This is where we will begin," Rylora said softly, her voice carrying a tone of finality. Ethan took a deep breath, steeling himself for what was to come. He had no choice but to follow her into the room. Inside, the space was as grand as the rest of the palace. There were large, elegant chairs, tapestries on the walls, and a bed that seemed more like a throne than a place to sleep. It was clear that this room had been designed with comfort and power in mind. Without saying another word, Rylora walked over to the center of the room and turned to face Ethan. She motioned for him to sit. Ethan hesitated for a moment before taking a seat, feeling the weight of the situation pressing down on him. The reality of what he was facing was starting to set in. He had never been forced into a relationship before, let alone with someone as powerful and important as Rylora. This was not how he had imagined his time on Hexarzul. He had hoped for peace, for mutual understanding between their cultures, but instead, he found himself caught in a web of ancient laws and expectations. Rylora's eyes studied him intently, as if she were waiting for him to say something. Ethan wanted to break the silence, to ask questions, but the words seemed to get stuck in his throat. "You are not the first to be placed in this position, human," Rylora finally spoke, her voice steady. "There have been others before you. It is the law of my people. It is not a punishment, but a necessary step to restore balance." Ethan looked up at her, his brow furrowing. "But what does this mean for me? What does being your mate mean exactly?" Rylora's lips curled into a faint smile, though it didn't reach her eyes. "It means that you will share in the responsibilities of leadership. It means that you will be my partner, in both mind and body, until the bond is fully formed. Only then will the law be satisfied." Ethan swallowed hard. The words mind and body rang in his ears, and he suddenly felt a wave of discomfort. This was more than just a formality. This was an intimate connection, something he had not prepared for it in any way. "I didn't come here to be a partner," Ethan muttered, more to himself than to her. Rylora's expression didn't change. "That may be so, but you are here now, and you must accept it. The law has spoken." Ethan leaned back in his chair, running a hand through his hair in frustration. He couldn't just accept this. How could he? He didn't know Rylora, and now he was supposed to form a bond with her. There had to be another way. There had to be something he could do to avoid this fate. But as he looked into her eyes, he saw no sign of hesitation. Rylora was resolute. She had her own beliefs, her own laws that had been followed for generations. This wasn't something she could simply change because he didn't agree with it. For the first time since arriving on Xarzul, Ethan felt utterly powerless. "You will be expected to learn our ways," Rylora continued, breaking the silence once more. "The bond is not just a matter of sharing space. It is a union of purpose and trust. You must earn that trust. It will take time, but it is necessary for both of us." Ethan stared at her, trying to make sense of her words. Was this just a ritual to her, a custom that she had been raised with her entire life, or was there more to it? He could sense something deeper in her tone, something that spoke of duty rather than desire. "Do you want this?" Ethan asked suddenly, his voice quieter now. "Do you want this bond, Rylora, or is this just something you have to do because the law demands it?" Rylora's gaze softened for a brief moment before she answered. "It is not about what I want or do not want. It is about what must be done. This is the law, and we are both bound by it." The words hung in the air between them, thick with unspoken tension. Ethan wasn't sure what to make of it. Did Rylora want to form a real bond with him, or was she simply going through the motions of a law she had no choice but to follow? He didn't know, but he couldn't deny the pull of curiosity. What would this bond really mean for them? Would it lead to something more than just duty, or would they remain strangers, bound only by law and circumstance? As Rylora turned to leave the room, her back straight and her expression unreadable, Ethan remained seated. He felt as if the ground beneath him was shifting, and he had no idea where it would lead. Ethan woke up early the next morning to the sound of soft chimes echoing through the palace. He had slept poorly, his mind racing with thoughts of Rylora and the strange situation he found himself in. Every time he closed his eyes, the image of her eyes, intense, unwavering, haunted him. How was he supposed to connect with her? What did she truly expect from him? Was this really just about the law, or was there something deeper to it? He swung his legs off the bed and stood, stretching as he tried to clear his mind. The room was quiet, serene even, but he couldn't shake the unease that clung to him. After a few moments, he made his way to the window and looked out over the alien city below. The landscape of Xarzul was breathtaking. Towering structures, sleek spaceships flying in the distance, and a bright sun that bathed everything in a golden glow. Yet none of it felt real. He was still trying to process everything, still trying to figure out how to navigate this strange world and what role he was supposed to play in it. He had been brought here to help establish peace, not to be forced into an alliance. But now, as the law dictated, he was expected to form a bond with Rylora, whether he wanted to or not. A soft knock on the door interrupted his thoughts. Without waiting for a response, the door opened, and Rylora stepped inside. She looked as regal as ever, her posture straight and proud. But this time, there was something different about her. There was a softness in her gaze that Ethan hadn't seen before, a hint of vulnerability hidden beneath the commanding exterior. "You are awake early," she remarked, her voice calm, almost neutral. Ethan didn't know how to respond. "I couldn't sleep." Rylora's eyes narrowed slightly, and she nodded. "The weight of the situation can be heavy. I understand." Ethan raised an eyebrow. "Do you? You seem perfectly fine with it." Rylora paused, her gaze dropping for a moment as if considering his words. "I am not immune to the responsibilities that come with my position," she said after a long silence. "But I do not wish to make this more difficult for you. The bond is not something I take lightly." Ethan felt a small flicker of hope. For the first time, Rylora's words felt genuine. Perhaps she didn't view this bond the same way she viewed it yesterday. Or maybe, just maybe, she was starting to understand how complicated it all was for him. I didn't ask for this, Ethan admitted, his voice quieter now. I never thought I'd end up here, on Xlars, with you. It's all so overwhelming. Relora studied him carefully, her sharp eyes reading him like an open book. You are not the only one who feels this way, but you must understand that this bond is part of the balance of our world. It is the only way to ensure peace. Ethan sighed, running a hand through his hair. I know, but I'm just not sure how to make this work. We're from different worlds. Different everything. For a moment, there was no response. Then, Rylora took a step closer to him, her presence filling the room. Perhaps we can start by understanding each other, she said, her voice softer now. We do not have to be enemies. We can be allies, even if we do not agree on everything. That is the essence of the bond. Trust. Ethan looked up at her, his heart pounding in his chest. The words were simple, yet they carried weight. Could he really trust her? Could he allow himself to form a connection with someone who was, for all intents and purposes, a stranger to him? He didn't know the answer. You talk about trust, Ethan said slowly. But how can I trust you when I don't even know you? Rylora seemed to consider this for a moment before she spoke again. You do not need to trust me right away. Trust is built over time. It is not an immediate thing, but we must start somewhere. Ethan stared at her, the tension between them palpable. He could see that she was trying, in her own way, to make this easier for him. She wasn't pushing him, but she also wasn't going to let him back out of this so easily. The law was clear, and it was something neither of them could escape. So, what now? Ethan asked, still unsure of what the next step was. Now, Rylora said, her voice firm once more, we begin with the basics. We will share meals, talk, and learn about each other. The more we understand, the easier it will be to form the connection. Ethan wasn't sure he was ready for that. But what choice did he have? He had to try, for his own sake and for the peace he had been sent here to help achieve. As Rylora turned to leave, she paused at the door and glanced back at him. I know this is difficult, but you will find, over time, that we are not so different. We both want the same thing. Peace. With that, she was gone, leaving Ethan alone with his thoughts. He didn't know if he believed her. He didn't know if he could. But for now, he would have to play along. The rest of the day passed in a blur. Meals were shared in silence, glances exchanged when words seemed too heavy. They spoke little, but there was something in the quiet moments that told Ethan they were both trying to understand one another. He wasn't sure where this bond would lead. But one thing was clear. Rylora was not the enemy. And maybe, just maybe, this was the beginning of something neither of them had expected. The days that followed were a blur of silence and awkwardness. Ethan and Rylora spent their time in the palace, moving from room to room, exchanging only necessary words. Ethan couldn't help but feel the weight of the bond hanging over him like an invisible force. It was a constant reminder of the situation he couldn't escape from. He was an unwilling participant in a marriage that wasn't his choice. Rylora, for her part, seemed to follow the law but also respected his space. She didn't push him, but her presence was always there, waiting. Sometimes he found her watching him, her eyes soft and curious, as though she were trying to read him. Other times she would sit beside him during meals, offering him quiet conversation, which he often found difficult to engage with. They were from two entirely different worlds, after all. One morning, as Ethan sat by the window, looking out over the city, Rylora approached him from behind, as if silently deciding that today would be different. "Are you always so distant?" she asked gently, her voice carrying a hint of amusement. Ethan turned to face her, feeling caught off guard. He hadn't expected her to speak so openly. He hesitated before answering, unsure of how to explain the way he felt. "I don't know how to be anything else right now," he replied. "This situation isn't easy for me. I'm trying to understand everything, but it's a lot." Raylora nodded, her expression thoughtful. I understand. It is not easy for anyone, but you must know, it is not only the law that binds us. There is something deeper, a purpose beyond what we can see. Ethan furrowed his brow. What do you mean by that? Raylora stepped closer, lowering her voice. The bond that is forming between us, it is not just an obligation. It is a connection that has been chosen by the universe. I know this may sound strange, but we were meant to meet, meant to work together. Ethan was silent for a long moment, unsure of how to respond. He had spent so much time thinking of this as something forced upon him. The idea that there might be a deeper meaning to it was difficult to grasp. But why me? He finally asked. Why not someone else? There must be someone better suited for this than me. Raylora's gaze softened, and for the first time, Ethan saw a glimpse of vulnerability in her. She stepped closer, her voice quiet. Because you have something no one else has. Your heart is strong, your mind sharp, and most importantly, you are human. You carry a strength that my people can learn from. We need you, Ethan. The weight of her words hung in the air, and Ethan felt a strange warmth spreading through him. He didn't fully understand what she meant, but it felt real. He couldn't deny that there was something about Raylora, something in the way she spoke, that made him question everything he had believed so far. I'm not sure what I can offer, Ethan said softly. I don't know how to be what you need. You don't need to be anything, Raylora replied. You just need to be yourself. Her words caught him off guard. No one had ever spoken to him like that. He had always been taught to be something more, to strive for greatness, to be perfect. But Raylora's approach was different. She didn't expect perfection. She just wanted him to be himself. For the first time in weeks, Ethan felt a sense of calm wash over him. Maybe he didn't need to have all the answers. Maybe all he had to do was take things one step at a time. That evening, as they sat together at dinner, Raylora made an effort to engage him in more casual conversation. She asked him about his life on Earth, the things that mattered to him, the places he had visited. As she spoke, she seemed genuinely interested in his answers, her voice light and warm, as if she were a friend rather than a lawmaker. Ethan found himself opening up in ways he hadn't expected. He spoke about his childhood, his love of adventure, and the dreams he had once had before everything changed. As the conversation flowed, he found himself relaxing, his walls slowly crumbling in the face of Raylora's understanding. You've led a fascinating life, Raylora said, her eyes bright with curiosity. I can see why the people of your world trust you. Ethan smiled, though it was a bittersweet smile. I never saw myself as someone worth trusting. But I guess we all have our moments. She nodded thoughtfully. I think you are more than you give yourself credit for. You have strength inside you, Ethan. Not just physical strength, but the kind of strength that can shape worlds. Her words lingered in his mind long after dinner was over. Could it be true? Was there really something special about him that could make a difference here? He didn't know, but for the first time, he was willing to consider it. The following days were filled with more conversations and small moments of connection. They trained together, learning from each other's cultures. Raylora taught him about her people, their history, and the complex ways they communicated. In turn, Ethan shared his knowledge of Earth, his science, and the technologies that had shaped human progress. They found common ground, building a bridge between their worlds that had once seemed impossible. Every day, their bond grew stronger, and slowly, the cold walls that had surrounded Ethan began to melt away. Yet, despite the progress they were making, there was still uncertainty in the air. The law still demanded that they be more than just allies. The weight of that expectation was never far from Ethan's mind. But as he spent more time with Raylora, he began to realize that perhaps this bond was not as much of a burden as he had first thought. There was something between them, something real. And that, for now, was enough. Ethan sat in a grand hall, his mind spinning, trying to make sense of the events that had unfolded so quickly. The words Raylora had spoken echoed in his mind like a drumbeat, growing louder with every passing second. You must become my mate. He couldn't believe it. This wasn't what he had come to Xarzul for. This wasn't part of the peace talks, and certainly this wasn't something he had expected to hear. As the council members murmured among themselves, Ethan tried to collect his thoughts. He had always been calm under pressure, but this was unlike anything he had ever experienced. He had been trained for diplomatic meetings, for negotiations, but no one had prepared him for the weight of cultural laws so different from his own. Raylora stood tall before him, her expression stern. It was clear that she was not just enforcing a law. She was honoring a tradition that had been in place for centuries. To her people, this was not a simple punishment. It was the law, and the law demanded respect. Ethan could feel her eyes on him, sharp and unwavering. You stand before the council, Raylora said, her voice firm, and you must now answer for your actions. Ethan swallowed hard. He had no idea how to answer. How could he explain that his touch had been nothing more than an instinctive reaction to try and prevent a fight? How could he make them understand that he never meant to offend anyone, let alone the warrior princess of an alien race? We will not stand by and allow an offense to go unpunished. One of the other council members, a blue-skinned alien with long tentacles, spoke up. His tone was as cold as Raylora's, though his eyes seemed to soften when he looked at Ethan. This law has been in place for millennia. It is clear, and it must be followed. Ethan looked around the room, his heart pounding in his chest. He felt trapped, like he had no way out. He had come to Xarzul to help broker peace, not to get caught in a political nightmare. Yet here he was, accused of breaking an ancient law, with no choice but to face the consequences. Do you understand the gravity of this, human? Raylora asked, her voice low but filled with authority. Ethan nodded slowly. He had to admit he understood. The law was clear in their eyes, and it didn't seem to leave room for mistakes. In Raylora's culture, a violation of personal space by someone of his rank wasn't just disrespectful. It was a breach of trust, a breach that required reparation. I understand, Ethan said quietly, trying to remain calm. But this is not how I intended it. I didn't mean to break your laws. Raylora's gaze softened for just a moment, but only for a moment. Intent does not change the law, she replied. The law is not just for your protection, human. It is for the protection of all who live by it. And if you break it, you must accept the consequences. Ethan felt a wave of frustration rise inside him. This wasn't fair. He had never been told that something as small as a touch could change the course of his life. He had always followed the rules, always played by the book. But here, in this alien world, the rules were different, and there was no room for mistakes. One of the council members, an alien with large eyes and glowing skin, leaned forward. The law is not cruel, human, she said gently. It exists to maintain balance and respect. Your bond with Raylora will restore that balance. It will bring peace. Raylora nodded solemnly, her eyes never leaving Ethan. You will serve as my mate, and in doing so, you will restore honor to both our peoples. We will move past this moment and build something stronger. Ethan felt his stomach twist. He was supposed to become Raylora's mate. He couldn't wrap his head around it. This wasn't just an alliance or a partnership. It was something far more personal. And what did that mean for him? Could he even live up to this strange law? As the council continued to discuss the details of his bond with Raylora, Ethan felt like a spectator in his own life. He was being dragged along by forces he didn't understand. He had come to Xarzul with a mission of peace, and now, it seemed, he was trapped in a situation where peace was the last thing on his mind. Hours passed, and finally, the council concluded their deliberations. They had decided that the bond would begin immediately. Ethan was to move into Raylora's quarters, where they would begin the process of forging their bond. He was to remain there, with her, until the bond was complete. The thought of living with Raylora, someone he barely knew and who was a stranger to him, made him uneasy. She was a powerful, imposing figure, and despite his best efforts to remain calm, the thought of being forced into such an intimate relationship with her sent waves of anxiety through him. But there was no arguing with the council's decision. The law was inescapable. And if Ethan was to continue to represent humanity in this alien world, he had no choice but to comply. As Raylora turned to lead him to her quarters, Ethan hesitated for a moment. He looked back at the council, at the room full of alien faces. Some looked sympathetic, others disapproving. But none of them spoke out against the decision. Raylora was waiting for him, her back straight, her eyes as hard as ever. He had no choice. He walked toward her, his steps slow but determined. This was not the way he had imagined his mission to go, but there was no turning back now. He had broken a law, and now he would have to face the consequences. But he couldn't help but wonder, what would it be like to live alongside Raylora? Would there ever be a chance for them to truly understand each other, or was this bond doomed to be nothing more than a symbol of a mistake? Ethan stood at the edge of the balcony, gazing out over the vast alien landscape. The towering structures of the city stretched out below him, glowing in the dim light of the setting sun. He had been on this planet for what felt like an eternity. And yet, he still couldn't shake the feeling that he was out of place. He was a human, far from home, bound by a law he hadn't asked for, forced into a situation he couldn't control. And yet, the more time he spent with Raylora, the more complicated everything became. He had come to learn that the bond between them was not just a simple law or obligation. It was something deeper, something he had not fully understood until now. The thought of their connection weighed heavily on his mind. Was he ready to accept it? Was he ready to be the partner Raylora needed him to be? Ethan's thoughts were interrupted by the soft sound of footsteps behind him. He turned to see Raylora approaching, her presence as graceful and powerful as always. She smiled when she saw him, her blue eyes sparkling with an emotion he couldn't quite name. "I've been looking for you," she said, her voice light and teasing. Ethan raised an eyebrow. "Looking for me? What for?" Raylora stepped closer, her gaze softening. "I wanted to talk to you. About us." Ethan's heart skipped a beat. He had known this conversation was coming, but he hadn't expected it so soon. He turned away from the balcony, walking back into the room, motioning for her to follow. Raylora sat down on the couch, her posture relaxed, but her eyes intense. "I know this is all happening very quickly. I know you didn't expect any of this, and that you probably feel trapped. But I want you to know something. I'm not trying to control you. I'm not asking you to be something you're not." Ethan took a deep breath. He had thought a lot about what Raylora had said, but hearing it again, it still felt strange to him. He wasn't sure what to feel. "But the law," he began, only for Raylora to gently stop him. "The law is a part of this, yes," she said, "but it doesn't define us. It doesn't define how we feel or what we can become. It only brought us together. What happens next is up to us." Ethan didn't know how to respond. He felt torn between the sense of duty to his world and the strange, almost magnetic connection he felt toward Raylora. "I don't know if I can do this," he confessed, his voice low. "I don't know how to be the kind of mate you need." Raylora reached out, her fingers brushing his hand gently. "You don't have to be perfect, Ethan. I don't need perfection. I just need you to be present, to be here with me, to let us learn about each other without fear or hesitation." Her words made something stir within him. He had spent so much time trying to push away the feelings, trying to hold on to his old life. But now, standing here with Raylora, he realized that it was no longer just about the law or the obligation. It was about a chance to discover something new, something that could change both of their worlds. Raylora smiled at him, her eyes full of warmth. "I don't expect you to have all the answers. I just want to walk this path with you, side by side." For the first time in a long while, Ethan felt a spark of hope. He had been afraid of losing himself, of being consumed by a law that wasn't his own. But maybe, just maybe, this was an opportunity for something different, something he had never expected. "I don't know where this will go," Ethan said slowly, his gaze meeting hers. "But I'm willing to try. I'll walk this path with you, Rylora." The tension that had been hanging in the air seemed to lift, and for the first time in what felt like forever, Ethan allowed himself to relax. He didn't have all the answers, but he was starting to understand that he didn't need to. Sometimes it was enough just to be open to what the future might hold. Rylora's smile grew, and she nodded. "That's all I need, Ethan. We don't have to have it all figured out today. We'll take it one step at a time, together." As the days passed, Ethan and Rylora's bond grew deeper. They spent more time together, talking about everything and nothing. They learned about each other's cultures, their hopes, and dreams. Slowly but surely, the walls Ethan had built around his heart began to crumble. He started to see Rylora not as a stranger or a lawmaker, but as someone who had her own fears, her own desires, and her own vulnerabilities. One evening, as they sat together in the gardens of the palace, Rylora turned to him with a thoughtful expression. "Ethan," she began, her voice soft, "do you ever wonder if we were always meant to meet? If the universe had a plan for us all along?" Ethan looked at her, the question lingering in the air between them. He had never thought of it that way before. Maybe there was something to the idea that their meeting was more than just a coincidence. "I don't know," he said honestly, "but I'm starting to think maybe it doesn't matter. Maybe what matters is that we're here now, and we're not alone in this anymore." Rylora nodded, her smile gentle and understanding. "I agree. And I'm glad we're here, Ethan. Together." As the two of them sat in the fading light of the evening, Ethan felt a sense of peace he hadn't known in a long time. The future was uncertain, and the road ahead was still unclear, but one thing was certain. Whatever came next, he wouldn't face it alone. The day had finally arrived. Ethan stood in front of the grand palace, his heart pounding in his chest. It felt as if everything had been leading up to this moment. The last few weeks with Rylora had changed him in ways he hadn't expected. He had come to understand that his life was no longer just about him. It was about the bond he shared with her and the future they were building together. He glanced to his side where Rylora stood, her presence as commanding as ever, yet her hand was resting lightly on his arm, a reminder of the journey they had both started. "Are you ready?" Rylora asked softly, her voice calm but carrying an unspoken question. This wasn't just a ceremony. It was a turning point in both of their lives. Ethan nodded, his nerves settling. He was ready. The uncertainty that had once clouded his thoughts was gone, replaced by a deep, steady trust in her and in what they were becoming together. The crowds were gathering in the palace courtyard, the air filled with a hum of excitement and anticipation. Today was the day that their bond would be formalized, not just in the eyes of the law, but in the eyes of the people of Rylora's world. They were taking the final step, confirming what had already been growing between them. Rylora squeezed his hand. "Remember, this is not just about the law or the tradition. It's about us, what we've chosen together." Ethan smiled at her, his heart full. He had once been overwhelmed by the idea of being bound by a law he didn't choose. But now, standing beside her, he realized that he had found something worth fighting for, something worth embracing. Their connection had become real, a force neither of them had expected, but both were willing to accept. They stepped forward, walking toward the center of the courtyard, where the ceremony was about to begin. The air was thick with the buzz of the crowd, but everything felt distant, as if time had slowed down around them. The focus was on them, the human from Earth, and the powerful alien woman who had captured his heart. At the front of the gathering, an elder of Rylora's people stood waiting. Her robes shimmered with colors Ethan didn't recognize, and her eyes were wise with age and experience. She was the one who would finalize their bond. "Rylora, daughter of the stars," the elder began, her voice clear and strong, "and Ethan, son of Earth, today you stand before your people. You are no longer two separate beings, but one. united by the bond of duty, of choice, and of love. Your union signifies not just an obligation to the law, but an agreement between two souls, each willing to accept the other, to grow together, and to build a future in harmony. Ethan felt the weight of the words, but more than that, he felt the truth behind them. This wasn't just a moment of legal formality. It was a moment of shared understanding. It was a promise to each other. R'hllora stepped forward, her gaze meeting his. In that instant, everything around them faded into the background. The only thing that mattered was the bond they had created. You stand with me, Ethan, not out of obligation, but out of a choice made with your heart, she said, her voice steady but filled with emotion. And I stand with you, not because the law demands it, but because you are the one I choose to walk this path with. Ethan could feel his heart swell at her words. She had said it so simply, yet with such depth. This was real. Their connection was real. It wasn't just about the law or what was expected of them. It was about what they had come to understand together. I choose you, R'hllora, Ethan said, his voice unwavering. Not because I have to, but because I want to. I want to be by your side, now and always. The elder nodded approvingly, and with that, the ceremony continued. There were words of binding, of promises made and shared, but it all felt like a formality now. Ethan and R'hllora had already made their promises to each other, and this moment was just a public affirmation of what they had already committed to in their hearts. As the ceremony drew to a close, the crowd erupted in cheers. Ethan and R'hllora turned to face them, hand in hand. The people of R'hlora's world, who had once viewed him as an outsider, now saw him as a part of their world. An equal, not just a human from another planet. It was a moment of triumph, not just for them, but for the unity between their two worlds. Later that evening, after the ceremony and the celebrations, Ethan and R'hllora stood together in the garden, gazing up at the stars. The night was calm, and the air was warm, filled with the sounds of distant music and laughter. This is just the beginning, R'hllora said softly, her hand resting in his. We have so much to look forward to. Ethan turned to her, a smile spreading across his face. I know, and I'm ready for it all. Together. They stood in the quiet, content in the stillness of the moment. There would be challenges ahead, as there always were, but now they faced them as a united front. They had chosen each other, not because they had to, but because they had found something worth cherishing, something worth fighting for. The stars above seemed to shine a little brighter that night, as if reflecting the promise they had made to one another. The future was unknown, but with each other, they felt ready to face it, hand in hand, side by side.